If you find yourself stuck in a self-destructive pattern of behaviour, then what's the best way forward? Out or through? That's a question I've asked myself, both in the abstract and in a more personal context, more than once, and maybe it's something you can relate to too, or maybe it's something you've seen in your favourite fictional characters. Maybe you can't relate at all, but in any case, it is relevant to the main character of the book that I'm going to be looking at in this episode today. That is the character of Ladze, who's the narrator of Notes of a Crocodile by Miaojin. And we might find along the way that Ladze and Chiu have some things in common. I won't be alone talking about this book. I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that. I'll be with Conor Stuart, so a fellow Stuart, but his surname is spelt with a UA and I'm the EW. So I'll let you decide which spelling is superior. I wouldn't like to judge that. Before we get on with the interview though, there's first, of course, the TrChFic news, the translated Chinese fiction news. Just three very light things this time, and they're not exactly all hot off the press. There's going to be links to all of them in the show notes. So one is a little article about a recent theatre production of Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman, which I covered. If you're a long-time listener, you will know, in the very first episode of this show. So it is a Polish director that directed this play, and he seems to have expanded on the story a bit. So I don't know, but it's just a fun thing to read. If you like Lu Xun, if you're interested in that story, go check it out. Link is in the show notes. Next thing, this is something perhaps a bit more substantive. Locus, who are, I believe they're a review site focused on science fiction, published the results of the 11th Chinese Nebula Awards. So it's a pretty handy resource. They've sought out those results in Chinese, translated them, published them in English. So if you're interested in Chinese sci-fi and you want to see who's brought out the big sort of winner stories, it's a terrible phrase. The big acclaimed, that's the word I'm looking for. The big acclaimed stories, then that is a little resource to check out. Again, links in the show notes. Last of all, now this is really not brand new news at all. This is something I was looking for some cool recent Zoom events to listen to when I'm working on YouTube, and I got one with the man himself, David Derwei Wang, esteemed, I believe he's a Harvard scholar of Chinese lit, and it's all about the legacy of Yu Hua, and it's a recorded Zoom event. It's an hour, 12 minutes and 29 seconds long. So if you're interested in Yu Hua, we've still not covered on the main feed of this show, shocked to say, but if you're interested in Yu Hua or indeed Professor Wang, check that out. Link again is in the show notes, or you could just search it up. I'm sure you can find it. So yeah, that's the TrChFic news. Just a swift one. Let's cut the crap. Let's get right to my interview with Conor Stuart about Notes of a Crocodile. Right, so on the show, we have Conor Stuart here to talk about Miaojin's Notes of a Crocodile. So first question, Conor, how's it going and what have you been up to?
Hi, I'm grand mostly. In Taiwan, it's been relatively normal. We've been having like big outdoor events and going to the beach and stuff like that. So I've been feeling a bit guilty in terms of family back home and people seeing me have fun and then feeling guilty for having fun. So it's been okay apart from that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. So earlier today, I was doing my interview with Chitawe, and Heinrich Tawe was saying that he gets a bit of FOMO or worries that there's not enough going on in his life when he looks at his social media, especially Instagram. And I answered to him, like, I don't really get anything like that. But one thing that has driven me slightly insane is seeing friends who are in countries that handled COVID properly, having nice, happy lives. Like before we hit record, we were talking about the Beijing Coma episode. My guest on that one was Ronald, who's over in Shanghai. And yeah, like you, he's been living a nice, normal, happy life for quite a long time now. And here I am in Dundee, still in lockdown. So envious of you. But envy aside, can you tell the listeners a wee bit about yourself and what you do?
Yep, I'm from Belfast originally. And then I went to Leeds, University of Leeds, to study Chinese and Spanish. And then during that time, I spent a year in Beijing. And then from that, I went to Taiwan I had a Morpha scholarship to do a year language. And then I ended up doing a master's degree in Taiwanese literature at National Taiwan University. where Miaojin also went, but not at the same time, obviously. After that, I spent some time working for newspapers here, and then I worked for an IP company doing media for them. And then eventually I got a job with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan. So
wow.
I'm doing kind of Facebook and social media for them. Just about my degree, the thesis was on Wunianjian, so theater. He did like a series of plays, but it was very popular kind of plays. On the side, I've done a bit of translation on my blog, mostly. I've translated stories for Ranqingyue, Yigeyin, Wu Wei, and a few others. I did a full-length novel for Yigeyin, but it hasn't been published, but it's on the back burner there somewhere.
Right. And we'll probably come back to this when we're doing the plugs at the end, but what's your website? What's your blog's web address?
Translatingtaiwan.com.
All right. So let's start with the crocodile, proverbially speaking, who's holding the pen of this book, Miaojin herself. So first question about her. Who was she, both as a person, and I guess who is she today as a figure on the literary landscape? Or who was she in her when she was alive? Who was she on the literary landscape? And then who is she today in Taiwan?
Qiu Miaojin was born in 1969 in Jianghua, in the west of Taiwan. She had a pretty privileged childhood, or a privileged, what you could say in terms of Taiwan is privileged. She went to the first girls' high school, which is the top female high school in Taiwan. She went to Taiwan National University, which is the top-ranked university. She graduated from psychology department there in 1991. She worked as a counselor and a reporter, and then she went to France, and she studied psychology there, and then transferred to feminist studies, studying under Hélène Cixous, a French thinker, a feminist thinker. And in terms of the personal aspect, she was a lesbian, and she seems to have dated openly, and that seems to have been, her life seems to have been quite similar to what is portrayed in the novel, although we're not sure how exactly they overlap. Mm-hmm. For example, there's a documentary by let me see. Oh yeah, Evans Chan did a documentary on her, and he had a lot of friends in her life talking about her dating life and her self-harm and other aspects of her life.
Yeah.
In terms of who she is in the literary landscape, I think Taiwan is unusual in the fact that lesbian or gay literature is quite mainstream. If you were to pick two categories of literature here, major genres representing Taiwanese literature, the nativist literature might be one category, and then modernist literature would be another one, and that would incorporate a lot of queer literature.
I was thinking about this when I was getting my Taiwan season that we're kicking off, or helping to kick off with this episode. I was noticing that a lot of the literature in translation that you could get from Taiwan, at least in English, was either somewhere in the queer or LGBT scene, or it was somehow connected with the indigenous people of Taiwan. And my cynical brain was like, is this just something that is translated because it ticks certain cultural interests of English speakers, or is it because it sets it apart from mainland or other Chinese literature as sort of a unique selling point, for market reasons? Or if cast cynicism aside, is this a fairly representative sample of lit from Taiwan that's making it into English? And yeah, I didn't realize that. Yeah, it's not just that. It's not what my cynical mind was imagining, that it's these very marginalized niche literatures that Western liberals basically are picking out. It's nice to know, I guess, that they really are quite a salient feature.
Yeah, it's interesting. Literature here is quite academic, and a lot of people, I'm not throwing shade on Taiwanese people. A lot of Taiwanese people read, but there's a gap between maybe between what is academically acclaimed, as with all countries, what's academically acclaimed and what is popular.
Sure.
So you get a lot of romance fiction, popular, there's a lot of trashy novels, which probably don't get translated, but they're fun to read, so they don't always have those themes. But if you're talking about the ones that are taught in like Taiwanese literature, history of Taiwanese literature, there does seem to be a lot of, I guess, gender transgression and a lot of queer literature.
Right. I think a little pet theory I developed and then was kind of saw confirmed across things I learned during this podcast was that there was a huge number of readers in mainland China based on what I was seeing when I lived there, but a lot of them were maybe reading stuff on their phone, web fiction, be it beautiful literary creations or, I don't know, fan fiction or erotic fiction, I don't know. And then I found that the answer to that suspicion was yes and no. There is a lot of sort of silly, I don't know, can't think of a better word for it than that, very lowbrow stuff out there on the Chinese internet, but also some really awesome Chinese authors, mainland Chinese authors got their start on like BBS, so forums and stuff. Do you know if there's a similar story in Taiwan, or do you have like just observation-based thoughts along those lines?
There's a famous author here, Giddens Ko, I think he's called. He made a start on PTT, I think, which is the Taiwanese bulletin board system version. But yeah, there is a lot of manga influence here. So a lot of people will be reading manga a lot from like Japanese translations or translations from Japanese. Like a heavy influence here. And then, yeah, there's a lot of web stuff. I'm not sure how much people get famous for that. I think a lot of the stuff that's online is more popular fiction, whereas the people who get treated seriously, they have a certain style that they have to. It's very. You can actually see it in Miaojin's work. Like I can see like a typical way that Taiwanese writers write would be to use the framework of modernism. So they have. I think there's a lot of borrowing of like the James Joyce style, Virginia Woolf, that kind of modernism, and combining it with like very highbrow ways of expressing yourself in Chinese. Whereas for me, I think mainland fiction tends to be more direct, more easy to read or easy to interpret for a foreign speaker.
Yeah.
In my view, anyway.
A word I quite liked that I've heard thrown around, I think I've thrown it around myself, is earthy. A lot of the a lot of rural settings, a lot of suffering. Yeah, it's fairly strong grounding in realism for the most part. And then, you know, the thing I'm covering up with the euphemism slightly is quite a lot of fecal stuff, farting and stuff, which is not my favorite part of mainland Chinese lit. But yeah, bringing it back to Miaojin, you mentioned her self-harm earlier, and we kind of have to say it would be silly not to mention that she's not with us anymore. She committed suicide at 26. And Notes of a Crocodile, I don't believe, I could be wrong here, I don't think any of the characters commit suicide, but sort of depression is pretty weighs pretty heavily in the book. Do you think, as readers, because we were saying before we started recording, that's basically what we both are. We're really just readers. As readers, do you think that Qiu Miaojin's suicide should color our reading, or is it better just to focus on the text?
There is actually several references to suicide in the text. I went back over it today just to check. But so Chu Kwang, he attempts suicide, and then Meng Sheng saves him. Mm-hmm. And then also, I think the sister of either, I think Tun Tun's sister or Jiro's sister commits suicide by hanging. Like she tries to, but she also fails.
Right.
But what I think, it's always hard to take an author away from the work. And I think that some people are tempted to view Notes of a Crocodile and the Montmartre book later as an extended suicide note. But I think that's kind of the wrong way to see Notes of a Crocodile. I'm not going to speak on Montmartre, but like in terms of Notes of a Crocodile, I think it's the wrong way to see the book, as there's a layer of reflection, I think, in this book. And we get that with the crocodile thread. Like you can see that this isn't just a stream of consciousness of despair. It's planned in a way. Like even you can see there's a better structure, or like a more reflective structure than just pouring out of whatever she was feeling at the time. And I think that it's sorry. I think that there is a sense that suicide comes into the work in more ways than just direct references to it as well. Like two out of the four, she references four Japanese writers. Two of them died by suicide. Dazai and Mishima both killed themselves. I think there's a certain touch of the cult of suicide. I don't want to say it in that kind of term, but there is a cult around almost a romanticization of suicide, which is quite common in Taiwan. Like there's a recent film called The Sun. I think it was nominated for the Oscars, maybe, or maybe not. But basically, it had a character who was completely superfluous to the plot, and he committed suicide, but it was in a very glorified way. And I think this kind of like rejection of society can get mixed in with the existential elements of the novel. So you can conflate existentialism and suicide, but I think it's not a wise thing to do. And we should look at the existential things for themselves, and not, you don't need to read the conclusion of her death, because the death is caused by whatever mental anguish or suffering she was going through. And you don't necessarily know if that is, she's just representing a character and we don't know how close that is to her own character. So it's not useful, I think, to her art. And it kind of like, it makes her art a bit cheap, or cheaper than it should be. I think you should like give it a bit more credit in terms of artistry than just chalking it down to an extended suicide note, really.
Yeah, I mean, to be really inappropriate, it's probably, when it comes to Miaojin and her suicide, remember, it's probably a good idea to remember the death of the author, not her death, but the theory that says, look, you really don't know what the author intended. But you are the meaning maker. It's your reading that determines the meaning of the text. So as you were talking, a few things popped into my head. One was, yeah, you're right, the prevalence of kind of not suicide, but suicidal characters. And maybe I think the way I was thinking of that vibe in the book when I was reading is like self-destruction. The narrator, the main character, is pretty self-destructive and kind of wallows in it as we can as people. There's a certain sort of maybe not masochistic, but like grim pleasure sometimes in consciously behaving against your own best interests, either because you think you deserve it or because you're getting some kind of short-term rush. And there's a few characters. I should have written down everyone's name, but there's the male character, the really Mengsheng. Yeah, he's like self-destruction sort of embodied. He's maybe the most extreme example of that, but I think it's there in a lot of the characters. Speaking of like the existential, the fact you raised existentialism, I like that for two reasons. One, it's a word I'm always trying to bring up on the show. I think it's proved pretty fruitful for me in reading stuff from the mainland. I couldn't really say exactly what it is. I mean, maybe all literature is just quite existential, but I found that's quite a good way, a fruitful way for me to read. Everything from Lu Xun to Liu Cixin. It worked for me. But existentialism, it's a nice framework, I think, because it can give you optimism, and it really powerful optimism, and it can give you the absolute depths of pessimism on the verge of nihilism. And I think that's something Notes of a Crocodile can do. So I've got two quotes here. One's from near the start, one's from near the end, and I think it sums up like what I think, how the book deals with sort of optimism and pessimism from my point of view. So this is the quote from near the start, and this might agree with what you were saying about the modernist like stream of consciousness writers. So yeah, here we go. Humanity stabs a bayonet into a baby's chest. Fathers produce daughters that they pull into the bathroom to rape. Handicapped midgets drag themselves onto highway overpasses to announce that they're about to end it all just to collect a little spare change. And mental patients have irrepressible hallucinations and suicidal urges. How can the world be this cruel? A human being only has so much in them, and yet you must learn through experience until you finally reach the maddening conclusion that the world wrote you off a long time ago, or accept the prison sentence that your crime your crime is your existence, and the world keeps turning as if nothing had happened. The forced smiles on the faces of the lucky ones say it all. It's either this or getting stabbed in the chest with a bayonet, getting raped, dragging yourself onto the highway overpass, or checking into a mental institution. So like, it's about as black as you can possibly imagine. It's really bleak. I mean, the line about your crime is your existence, I suppose that could be a reference to being an LGBT person in Taiwan. But the reading that jumps out to me is that like existing is just hard as hell. It's an existential perspective. So that's near the start. And how could anything possibly pick up? But near the end, there's a section that spoke to me just as much. But I thought it was really kind of, it's not cheerful, but I found it very optimistic, the same way that, I don't know, the stuff out there you can read from Albert Camus is optimistic. So this is the start of a short chapter called Death Experience Number 1. So sounds not very cheerful, but this is it. A certain part of me has died as I've learned to leave behind the qualities of my youth, the over-anxiousness, over-sensitivity, and self-consciousness, not to mention arrogance and idealism that diminish with life experience. I was a late bloomer, but at long last, I lost my innocence. Like anyone else when they're young, I harbored lofty expectations, but lacked the self-knowledge to comprehend my own passions and vices. So like that's near the end of the book. And the feeling I kind of got is through this book, Lads, the narrator, kind of Chio's stand-in, goes through the absolute ringer. And it's I think in some ways it's the ringer of becoming an adult, but also compounded on top of that, she's a lesbian coming out of the closet. At least on a personal level, she's coming to terms with herself and meeting other queer people. But yeah, by the end of it, I got the sense that this character was probably not going, like in my mind anyway, as Lads gets older, Lads is probably going to become a fairly well put together person who's not going, maybe I'm being too judgmental here, but it seems like Lads is on a road to being fairly mentally healthy, or if not mentally healthy, functional. So I think if I read the book and you asked me, where do you think this author went in their life, I'd probably say, oh, she probably is okay now. So it's all the more sad that for me anyway, that Miaojin's not with us anymore, because it seemed at the end of things, not a cheerful book, but a book about getting better. That was quite a long spiel.
No, I wanted to address a few points you brought up. I had like mixed feelings about the book. I started to dread like having to read, like when I was doing the reread, like I read it a long time ago, but rereading it, I started to dread like, oh, I'm going to be at the beck and call of this emotional woman, like just playing with my emotions. But I think that's part of that was me seeing a bit of myself in her, and the struggle when you're coming to terms with yourself, whether you're gay or not, or whatever you are in the world. It's still when you're growing up, you become a different person. And I think that if you're repressing a part of yourself, the logic that you start to create gets completely mucked up, like completely crazy. And right. I think a lot of that, what you're talking about, the self-destructiveness, is that like faulty logic working in her head. Like you see the consistent pattern, and she sees the consistent pattern that she's doing. She pursues them until they need her and they want to rely on her. And then at that moment, she pulls away and says, oh, actually, like, I don't need your drama in my life, which is like, she's been making promises of like forever love. But for her, it makes sense because she's saying, I need to pull away from you before I get hurt, because if you start to love me, then this will become real. And then I'll have something real to lose. And from the documentary, it seems that this is actually like a pattern that Miaojin herself had in her relationships. She was cutting her wrists, and apparently there was a scar on her wrist from each relationship she'd had. And the last relationship before she decided to take her own life was the one that she got left first. So in every other relationship, she'd been the one to leave. And then in the final one, it's when, but the angst that you described, like to some extent I could identify with it. There was a poet in the documentary who described I thought she described it quite well, that the book is kind of shameless in its pouring out of like it's shameless kind of in several ways. It's shameless in the way it pours out suicide, like ideation. It has like the lesbian aspect. It's just she's not being ashamed of any of the parts of her. She's confiding all this to the reader, and I think that what the poet in the documentary was saying, that it's like she is living the hysteria that is the stereotype of woman, like the hysterical woman, or like embodying that in a text. But I got irritated. I saw like a quote that you messaged me in one of the questions you sent me earlier. She talks about herself a lot. She makes the criticisms that anyone would make of her book herself in the book.
Yeah.
So she calls herself monotonous. She goes on about how she's droning on about things, and then she finds the solutions to all the problems that she has, but she doesn't apply them. And she gives like really great advice to Zhou and to Tun Tun, but she doesn't take it. And you can see like that's part of that logic of self-destruction that you're talking about as well, I think.
I know we were talking about modernism earlier, but I think there's quite a few postmodern things you could point to in this book, and like the whole self-awareness to the point of ridiculousness thing. So I'm thinking of like, there was a certain, when I was younger, I used to really like it when like as a kid, I think, or a teenager, I used to really enjoy it when a movie or a cartoon or a show would call attention to the fact that it was a movie or a cartoon or
Breaking the fourth wall.
yeah, basically, yeah, or more subtle stuff, but especially breaking the fourth wall. And I think when I got older, I got a bit more choosy about that, because say, for example, a character in said, let's call it a film, would say, well, this narrative is ridiculous. There's a plot hole. How do you explain that? And then you, the viewer, are supposed to be like, yeah, really funny. Yeah, but at the same time, it's like, hang on a minute, you're just being lazy. You're riding a little postmodern cultural wave for a cheap laugh that lets you off the hook for other problems that a committed modernist would recognize as genuine problems. But it's weird. I could see that a lot of the criticisms of the book, and like like I said there, I'm pretty no longer so into. I'm pretty jaded when it comes to sort of postmodern playfulness or writers kind of making excuses for themselves by preempting their critics. But I didn't really get fed up with the narrator. I think maybe just, to be honest, because she's quite miserable, and I like it when fiction sort of acknowledges how miserable it can be to be alive, because a lot of it doesn't. But I could see why it would get tiresome, because it is pretty intense or over the top at points.
With LGBT writing, there's been such a focus on misery for so long,
right?
But I think that if you're in the LGBT community, and so we've had waves, like there's been I think Miaojin is maybe in the part of the gay movement which was like a rejection of heteronormativity and a bit more transgressive, like, and she didn't see herself ever being accepted. But if you look at contemporary Taiwan, the majority of the gay community here now, we got gay marriage passed. It's far closer to heteronormativity now, like the way that the gay community want to be seen, compared to the more radical history of the gay movement, which is, it's a very short history, like the gay movement here, but it's very interesting in that the movement itself is a lot more radical than the majority of the people within the community. Like, because with the gay community, I guess it's a lottery of who gets born and in which situation. But it's interesting that I think that if Chum Miaojin was alive maybe 2 decades later, I wonder, would she still be as transgressive, or would she like be a middle-aged woman who like has like 3 babies with another one? Like, it's interesting to me, like, how much of it is the LGBT angst and how much of it is actually just mental illness, like, or mental suffering. Because not all, like, I was reading another book recently called Grandma's Girlfriends, which is about a much older generation of of gay women in Taiwan and how they, like, of different classes as well, and how they went about their lives, but they didn't have this massive depression or angst. So I think to some extent we can't really conflate the being in the closet with, as much as I might have experienced some of what Miaojin went through. I don't think it explains it all, and there is an aspect of, because I think we get obsessed with putting it in queer literature and putting it in the framework of, she was a queer writer, she was a lesbian writer, but she's also representing the traditions of like Osamu Dazai and the Kobo, and she references other traditions, and she sees herself as being in that tradition, not as a queer writer. She didn't even associate very much with the queer movement in Taiwan, according to the documentary.
So I'm lucky enough to have read one of Osamu Dazai's books, No Longer Human. This is available in translation. So I read the English version as an ebook. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. And it reminded me of some of possibly the very first translated East Asian lit I read, long before I knew I was going to be spending any time in that part of the world. I read In the Miso Soup by Ryu Murakami. Someone, I think, might have accidentally shelved it on the teen fiction shelves at my local Borders, which is a mistake. But I think I knew what miso soup was, and I liked the cover. And yeah, it was this extremely like intense, violent, quite existential, weird story. And then I've read some more of his books since, and I've read a few Chinese authors who remind me of him, like the like Murong Shuai-sun and maybe not so much Wang Shuo, but a few of these authors who do these very bleak, morally transgressive, existential, strange, often quite short, fast-paced stories with a lot of indulgence, self-destruction. And then this one, I could see this one fitting in that tradition. I don't know if that tradition has a name, but it's something I've encountered reading Japanese stuff in translation and Chinese stuff in translation, and now I guess Taiwanese stuff in translation. And yeah, I think for me, I enjoyed reading the book through that sort of reference point, as well as the queer literature. They both seem to work. I don't know what I would call that tradition, though. Is there a name for it?
I don't know. I think there probably is, but I don't have it on me. But
what you were saying about the differences in the like activism or the queer culture back then and now. So how back in Chio's time, there wasn't much accommodation with laws or mainstream society. So there wasn't things weren't being framed in terms of like marriage, sort of normative ways of having relationships. So there was the radicalism. And then in Taiwan today, I don't know so much, but I've, in a little bit of reading for this season, I've learned some of the radicalism. The radicalism is now sort of perhaps coming up at odds against the less radical progressive visions. I don't know if there's conflict, but yeah, there's the question of, okay, once you have gay marriage, mission accomplished, or have you just been sort of subsumed in a way?
Well, there is an interesting point there, in that the first marriage bill, the first proposed marriage bill, was not a normal marriage bill. It was a diverse families bill, which would have made you could have gotten any number of people becoming a family. So you could have 3 partners or 4 partners registering as a family, and that got rejected because it was too radical.
Right.
Another point is that the Gay Pride Parade, reportedly, this is what was reported in the media anyway, which is all I know. Apparently the organizers wanted to be more inclusive of the leather and drug chemsex community.
Right.
And I think somebody put that on a post in the Pride group, whether it was intentional by the organizers or not. It was reported in the media that there was people were trying to make it, I guess, like
adult,
to bring something from the margins of the gay community, like, or things that are perceived as negative within the gay community, like chemsex or BDSM, and take them to the. But I think at that point there was a lot of pushback by the more heteronormative, or I'm not saying heteronormative in a bad way, but people who are try to live their lives normally, and
The take it easy crowd.
yeah, or log cabin Republicans, but yeah, the Tony's version, yes.
Yeah. So the other thing you said that sort of ties into that is like, yeah, what would it have been like if Joe was like our age living in this decade? And this is, I always try and bring up this TV show on my podcast. Did you ever watch or hear about a show called Mr. Robot?
Yeah.
Did you watch it?
Yeah.
Well, not to spoil anything too much, but do you remember near in the end, the character White Rose, who's a trans woman who in basically needs to keep her her male and female personas separate because the society she's in, it hasn't been accepted, or at least in her early years, that kind of bifurcation happened because there was no way to reconcile her trans identity with how she could live her life. But then we see a glimpse of a sort of a better world, and I really can't spoil that too much, but we see a much happier White Rose who hasn't become the main villain of the show. Is just living her life as a woman. So it's not just that she's not the bad guy anymore, it's that all the really dark, the angry side of her character is not there anymore. And I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that a lot of the things we consider mental illness are a product not just of a flaw in ourselves, but they're determined by our conditions, be it our material conditions or the society we're in. So yeah, the fact that, what am I trying to say? Yeah, if Cho was our age, born in the more modern Taiwan, it makes complete sense to me that she might have lived a really different, and perhaps from a literary perspective, less interesting life because those pressures weren't there.
I almost think that you're still like that kind of like point of view, like very similar to a lot of my classmates in my class in Taiwan. I had a lot of people who were obsessed with Yuan Sun and Miaojin, both of whom committed suicide. But what I almost think is that like people are conflating depression and creativity, whereas I think depression is actually a sapper of creativity in many ways. And I think it's like an unfortunate. I think it almost like I had a classmate who wouldn't go and get her depression treated because she felt it was tied to her creativity. But it's just like I don't want her to live that life just to.
Yeah, it's a dangerous assumption to work on, isn't it? Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, depression isn't exactly a energizing or mobilizing force. What I think anger can be, though, or frustration. I've done a little bit of creative writing here and there, and for me anyway, it's maybe not the strongest motivation for making me want to write. Excitement is probably the best one, but like for a runner-up, I might choose frustration or anger. Yeah. Maybe that's my problem. I think we've probably talked about the author herself enough. Probably a good idea to get onto the story now. So I guess first we can just quickly try and summarize what it's about. I think I read this one recently enough. I'll give it a shot, and then if you think I've missed anything really crucial, we can include that. So we're following at first an unnamed author as she, I guess, she's just left home, or she's left the girls' school she was at, and she's off to study Chinese lit at Taiwan's top university.
It's it's Chinese lit. Oh yeah, it is. Yeah,
it is. Yeah, the one detail I remember. And she finds she has a crush on, I think, one of her classmates who's a little bit older than her, just a couple of years older than her, I think. And they get into a relationship which forms that pattern you described. It gets a little bit progressively more fraught after having started out as quite a sweet relationship. And that takes up, like, I think maybe the first third of the book. Because I remember the blurb, I think, sort of frames it as she is part of this group, a very diverse group of queer characters. But I think they only sort of come to the fore maybe in the middle section of the book. And the main character sort of has to wrestle with a lot of her own problems. That her first relationship ends. She has another sort of affair with a considerably older woman. The dynamic is essentially the older woman is sort of living a double life. She has a straight relationship with a man her own age, which is pretty dysfunctional. and she ends up opting for that life over staying with our narrator. And then I think our narrator finally has some kind of reconciliation with her first love. And then we end, I think, on a sort of a hopeful note. But what I've missed out is interspersed in little episodes, we see a less realistic narrative about this crocodile, or this, what is it, a crocodile who's trying to wear a human suit, just sort of having these little episodes in some kind of parallel version of daily life where like she goes around, or it's not gendered, it's an it, isn't it? It goes around like stroking fur coats in shops or buying cream puffs. And it's very sort of cute and peculiar and a bit more experimental. And while that's going on in this strange mirror narrative, there's lots of snippets of radio and TV, Taiwanese media, where there's all sorts of crazy speculation about who these crocodiles are. And there seems to be a mixture of like genuine curiosity and fondness, and then an urge to like police the crocodiles. And then it all ends, and it's kind of a humorously contrasted with the crocodile's life, which is like boring, sort of like lying around, nothing very frightening. And then at the end, the crocodile sort of shyly reveals itself to the nation. So that, I mean, the reading of that seems fairly easy. I guess it would be Taiwan, post-martial law Taiwan, coming to terms with the existence of queer people, I guess, who are coded as crocodiles. Have I missed anything?
Just not that important, but the Jiro and Tuntun and then Mongshan and Chu Kwang's relationship are like kind of side pieces, I guess.
Yeah, in the little group of friends that the narrator, who we find out gets nicknamed Ladza, becomes a part of, there's a fairly dysfunctional gay male relationship, and there's a more wholesome but also sort of flawed female lesbian relationship. And Ladza has different interactions with these four different people. And yeah, I really should have remembered their names, but the two girls are Tuntun and
Jiro
and Tuntun, and the two guys are Mengsheng and
Chu
Kwang. Yeah, they're probably, I don't think they figure too much in the plot, but they're interesting figures thematically.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting is there was like a parallel for me between Crystal Boys by Shin Young. It's like one of the main gay novels in Taiwan. Recently they did like a musical version of it in TrChFic Memorial Hall. It was or the concert hall. It was really good. But there's a pair in there who are kind of a mythological pair in the 288 park, and they have this violent relationship, and one kills the other.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting the way, like, it always seemed, because there's also been like a lot of media speculation about violence in same-sex partnerships in Taiwan.
Right.
And there was a statistic the other, like from 2019, they said like that 90% of people in same-sex relationships don't report violence of their partners or something. But there seems to be like a focus on violence in gay relationships anyway. Like Chu Kwang, if we're to believe, Mengsheng stabbed him in the chest, and there's a lot of that kind of. I thought it was interesting. I mean, even Miaojin, like even lads. I think there's also like, if not physical violence, there's psychological violence there, or psychological harming of the other.
Yeah. The thing about the Chu Huang and Mengsheng, like the scene when they're introduced as a couple, like they're brawling, if I remember right, and there's continued references to their like battles with each other, and I was like, oh, this is a depiction. I can't think of any depiction of a male gay couple in media or fiction or films I've seen that's like that, unless you're counting something like Point Break or something.
Well, there's a recent film. Came out in Taiwan. What's it called again? Sorry, can I just Google it quickly? I forgot what the name was.
Yeah.
I wrote a review of it, but it was basically it was very rapey, kind of in the your name engraved herein. And so this is also filmed just as I think it was filmed. It wasn't filmed. It was set when I think Chang Qingguo died. So when would that be? And 1988, I think. And so the relationship between the two guys was very stalkerish and unpleasant and involved forced, I guess, sexual pleasure. And it's funny how a lot of it's been interpreted largely as a romantic film, whereas when you look at it from a modern perspective, or from my perspective anyway, it seemed not very nice, or not not sweet, not interesting.
Like a psychological thriller, more than a romance story, if it's that dark.
Yeah, but the way it's seen or interpreted in Taiwan is more focused on the positive, and that, oh, they were sweet, it could have been, but they, because of the times, they didn't get to be. So I think there's like a lot of because people are repressed in that era, then we sweep a lot under the carpet about what is appropriate and what is acceptable behavior. Like,
Yeah. It made, I mean, maybe this is a really misinformed perspective, but the thing I noticed, or I was thinking as I was reading about these two couples, so Chu Kwang and Meng Sheng, and then they're not really a mirror image, but the lesbian couple, Tun Tun and Juro, although I think one of them is specified as being like the more masculine one and one is the more feminine one, they're both pretty girly, or at least they're
yeah,
described as being quite feminine. And then the two guys are, I mean, one of them I think is described as being more macho, but they're basically both quite
very masculine.
aggressive, masculine, edgy guys who like to fight and ride around on motorcycles. And I don't know, it doesn't, I mean, it's not like that's something I've never seen in real life or seen in media, or it's something I can get my head around, but it wasn't what I was expecting. And it's interesting that you're saying there's other sort of examples of that in like fiction or media in Taiwan. Because like I'm trying to think on stuff I've seen or read from mainland China. I mean, I guess there's just not very much. I do remember seeing this rather strange film set in Xiamen, a mainland Chinese film about a gang of male criminals, and it seems like they've kidnapped a child, but then you find out near the end that actually they just wanted to sort of raise basically a queer family. But it was like, this is a very strange, like given what's allowed to be made in mainland China, this is a weird thing.
Yeah, there's actually a recent gay series. It was based on a series of novels called Addiction. It got taken off the shelves in mainland China eventually, but it aired long enough for it to become quite a mainstream hit. But it was like very similar in that they were both very masculine characters, and there was a little bit of that's pretty much rape dude in it. Like it's like you can't tie someone up and then like it be love whenever you have sex with them enough so that it becomes love, like is the logic of it, like kind of. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure how healthy that is but it seems to be popular in the BL category of a boys love category of manga/romance novel.
Yeah, that seems like something that we might accept if it's like in Game of Thrones with Daenerys and Khal Drogo, but yeah, in a modern setting,
yeah. But I think the idea of forbidden love, like that was so prevalent in this era. A lot of things get conflated that maybe you would, if it was a straight, I said normal, oops, a straight relationship, you wouldn't be as forgiving of certain things. But
yeah,
I get what you mean, because I think that like the point that I think you were almost making there was that in our general perception of Taiwanese relationships, or even gay relationships all around the world, there's an idea that there's a more masculine one and a more feminine one. So you get that in stuff like Modern Family,
right.
and that was to some extent
It's a bit normative,
a
isn't
very
it?
common thing in Taiwan among lesbians. So you get this like T versus the po in Taiwanese lesbian relationships. And so the T was more tomboy or masculine, and then the Po was more feminine. So that has been a structure in Taiwanese relationships for a long time. But then, yeah, so in this book, although the main character and Shui Ling seem to have that kind of relationship,
Yeah, that's quite clear. Yeah.
There is the side piecing of this other relationship, which is two feminine girls, although they both end up being straight in the end, or I guess living their lives as straight people in the end.
Yeah, there's a lot to chew on, and it might pop up later depending on how I frame some of my other questions. But speaking of questions, getting back on track, here's another one I got written down. It's just about the engagement with ideas in the book. That it's a pretty cerebral book. So we already mentioned there's some direct reference. There's a lot of like name dropping of authors. I remember lots of name dropping of like fiction authors, like we were saying, the various Japanese authors. Murakami's in there as well, which just goes to show how long he's been a big deal in outside of his own country. And I might call back here to the interview I mentioned having done earlier today with the Membranes, because the Membranes also is, I think it's even more prolific in its name dropping, and it name drops non-fiction like Judith Butler and stuff, as well as fiction. And I don't remember if Notes of the Crocodile name drops any non-fiction, but there's like an engagement both with there's intellectual ambitions and also sort of intertextual ambitions. Do you have anything you can say at that? Because I'm kind of struggling here to make a point.
I think that this is very, very common in Taiwan, like Taiwan literature. If you read one book, you feel you have to read like about 25 books to actually understand what the point they were making. And I think it goes, basically, I think it's all James Joyce's fault. Like, because James Joyce is like a deliberate attempt to be, how do you say that word again? Erudite, I guess. And to make references, obscure references to, like, James Joyce is famous for it in his later work anyway. And I think that caught on in Taiwan and became off the mode. So you see it in Notes of a Desolate Man as well by Zhu Tianwen. Like, that book is just full of references to other books and other things. And then you've got Wang Wenxing, who is like another famous writer who wants you to read his book. He famously said he wanted you to read it one character at a time and spend like time analyzing this character, then move on to the next. And it's like a lot of energy to expend on the book. And I think it takes away from the readability a bit. Like, if you have to constantly make references to outside the frame of the book, and then maybe, so if you have to take a break every time to read a book, it's going to take up a lot of your time. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily something I like about the story. I think that, yeah, you can make references to ideas without having to drop the name. And then it becomes a bit more interesting because you've engaged with the idea as opposed to trying to just show off your scholarly knowledge. Like, the Taiwanese literature classes that I took, we had a heavy focus on modernism. So Judith Butler was there, all the like literary theory and criticism. So Taiwanese people are very definitely engaged with literary theory from the West. So I'm not surprised that kind of thing crops up, because if you're a scholarly person like Miaojin was, then that's the way that students at NTU get on. Like, that's how they are anyway. But
right. Well, I'm glad we can pin that all in James Joyce and pernicious Irish influence on Taiwan. Sorted. I was going to say, I guess, two things to play devil's advocate slightly, or trying to add something. One is, without those name droppings of like Osamu Dazai and Mishima and Murakami, we maybe wouldn't have had the conversation about them and the existential themes. So I think, yeah, name dropping is definitely often used as a sort of a pat on the back, sort of a way to hand yourself some cultural currency. But the way that an intertextual link can function like a web link, it steals something almost from whatever you're referencing. So it can be fruitful, but yeah, I think if you can overdo it, definitely. And how much whether or not it's overdone, I guess, is subjective depending on the reader. Like I was more tolerant of it than you, but I could also sense she was approaching my tolerance limit, and if she crossed it, I might have got fed up and read the book much more slowly.
I liked it a bit more the way she dealt with Kobo than the way she dealt with the other ones. I liked the engagement with the crocodile and I like the fake ones better than the real ones a lot. Like the Genet stuff being a crocodile, that crossing over into the crocodile world, and like maybe because I read a bit of Genet, so I knew the kind of reference, but I think it did get a bit much, but it's like I don't mind if you use it, but you give me some of what they have, but there wasn't much. It was just a name drop, the crocodile, like you give me a present or something, and I'll give you this from him. So it wasn't really used so much, I think.
Yeah, it's like if you don't know what the reference is to, then it's wasted on you. It's just going to alienate you. The other thing I was going to say is one possible explanation for why this name dropping is so big in Taiwan, beyond just sort of cynical trying to show off and climb up the ladder of prestige.
I hope that Taiwan doesn't think that I think they're like that. I love you, Taiwan.
The ministers are going to descend on both of us. No, what I mean is like an explanation of all the name dropping that I read actually in Ari Heinrich's intro to the Membranes was that Taiwan in the 80s and 90s, after martial law was lifted, had a bit of a mass influx of foreign culture. And this is something I don't know much about. I know it in the mainland Chinese context in the 80s with Gaga Kaifang, reform and opening. So suddenly all this Western and other, but especially all the Western culture comes flooding in, and it becomes cool to walk around in your jeans eating French fries. And like, I don't know how much, I guess you probably would know about this, but like a thing that interested me was on the show when I covered Flock of Brown Birds, Hese Niaojin by, oh no, what's his name? Oh, God damn it. Oh, Gufei. That was a very sort of Freudian, like pre-World War II modernist sort of surreal story, but written in 80s China. And the reason was that was all the stuff that mainland Chinese literati were devouring, was this stuff that is really to my liking, but they were giving you like, they were writing it in a much more, in the 80s, in a much more modern time. So in a way, they were doing the sort of dreamy, surreal 1930s, 40s thing, but in a way that might be even more intelligible to a modern person, even though it's in China, because it's got that lag in time, which was only exists because of censorship, basically, national boundaries delaying the entry of these or suppressing the entry of these literatures into China. So I don't know if Taiwan had a similar thing where, there was this martial law dam, and then suddenly the dam bursts, and then you have for a decade a massive flourishing and intertextual surge. I really don't know much about that. Do you know much about that?
Not beyond that, really. I know that definitely during the martial law period, there was a lot of people forget that actually Taiwan equally had quite suppressive rules about censorship and what was allowed, but I can't really go into much detail beyond that. I know that there are certain books were banned, and they had like haircuts had to be like boys had to have short hair and girls had to have long hair, but beyond that, I'm not super sure. There's a few documentaries about the queer movement when it got started in Taiwan, and the first few pride parades, which were interesting, but that was well after martial law had been lifted. So
yeah, I think this is, I'm going to go into conspiracy theorist tanky mode for a minute. My feeling is that as Westerners, these things aren't, we're not given lies, but we're led to believe that during the Cold War, any country that was on the side of the West must have been a liberal democracy. So I think my default assumption was, okay, North Korea, South Korea, one's with the Allies, one is in is one of the red communist countries. Oh, so therefore North Korea must have been the same sort of dictatorship it is now. South Korea must have been the free democratic country that it is today. And then I read a book on Korea, and I was like, oh no, not true at all. And it lines up, from what I remember, its period of opening up lines fairly evenly with mainland China's, the 80s. Not obviously China's not a democracy now, but there's a parallel. And then learning about Taiwan, I was like, oh right, okay, so it didn't just become a democracy as soon as it got split off from a mainland. Not at all. It's like a similar story.
But funnily enough, even Ireland has a similar enough story with the power that the Catholic Church had in Ireland, right up until quite recently. Like it's funny, like what you say that. Like I agree with you. Like that we simplify things in our mind, and the baddies and the goodies, kind of. But
totally. I think So I should mention Scotland. Like I think a lot of Scottish people don't. I mean, I didn't know this, and I still don't have a very clear view, but like pre-80s Scottish politics was very different to what it became. I know that people used to call the Scottish National Party the Tories in kilts, and they were, and I think that from what as far as I'm aware, that the Conservative Party was more of a presence in Scotland right up until poll tax, which sort of ushered in like the purge of the Tories in Scotland, and more or until recently the status quo that I grew up in. But yeah, if no one tells you what came before the status quo, then even if no one lies to you, your assumptions are going to sort of fill in the blanks wrongly. Yeah, I was going to say, I had a bit of a thing that sort of opened my eyes to some history, but also gave me a clearer view of some differences between modern Taiwan and modern China. The one time I visited Taiwan, I was in Taipei, and it just so happened one of the places I visited was a park where some I think government killing of protesters.
228.
Pretty sure.
The February 28th incident.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah, I wandered into that park and visited the museum or read the signs. And it was a Mandarin-speaking country, but something like that would be inconceivable in like Tiananmen Square.
It's interesting for two reasons. That park. So the massacre in 1947, I think it was. But regardless, that is actually the setting for Bai Xianyong's Crystal Boys. So that park is very queer, and that's the new park. So that's where a lot. Oh shit! Earthquake. Okay, it's gone.
Is that a real earthquake? Bloody hell!
Are you okay?
Oh yeah, I can see you. For listeners, there's a fish tank behind Conor's head, and I can see the water swaying.
I got an earthquake alert, but yeah, it's fine.
Bloody hell. Yeah, there's something you wouldn't have to deal with in Scotland or Ireland.
Sorry, I lost my tracker.
You were talking about Bai Xianyong's Crystal Boys Park.
Oh yeah, so that was where the Crystal Boys was set. So queer people would go to that park, and they still do, like occasionally, not me, to find partners and to hook up in the toilet, apparently. But so yeah, that's like a big. But what I was going to say about the 228 incident is that Taiwan has set up a transitional justice commission, and so with Taiwan, they're reflecting, the government, in fact, is emphasizing the change from military, from the what's it called? From the military what? I forgot. Yeah, so the Transitionary Justice Commission is emphasizing the change from the dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek to democratic Taiwan, which is what they judge as, I think, Lee Teng-hui's second term. But yeah, it's interesting that a park can take on two completely different identities in reference to the queer culture. So Bai Xianyong's work was being published in the 70s and 80s, even though it was like really gay in its themes. And I thought that was odd because that was still during martial law, and yet he could publish that and it's fine. But he didn't identify as a gay person, as a gay author, but I think that goes back to the novel, like the everybody worrying about being perceived as a crocodile, but being interested. Oh, aftershock.
It's funny, coming through on my headphones, it just kind of sounds like someone tapping their feet, but I can see the water swaying behind you. Oh, Jesus, there it goes. Fucking hell, that's an earthquake. Yeah. This has not happened on the podcast before. It's a good thing we've got the video on, or I would have just been listening to a quiet thumping noise.
Okay, I think it's dying down again now.
I forgot to ask, are you in Taipei? Are you elsewhere?
Yeah, I'm in Taipei.
Right.
Good thing, right? Sorry, every time I have an earthquake, I forget what I was talking about.
I think that's understandable. The crocodiles in relation to Xinjiang.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, like, the crocodile, everyone doesn't want to appear like a crocodile. Like, they're worried about being perceived as a crocodile. And that was, I don't know if it was like a direct reference to Bai Xianyang, but like Bai Xianyang didn't come out until much later, being gay. So he's writing about crocodiles. And I think like the media scrutiny, I certainly have seen within my period of being in Taiwan, like reports in the newspaper about these gay parties being uncovered, and like you see them all photographed, like with their all their legs crossed, and they were caught with like, I wasn't sure why they were caught exactly, but apparently it's to do with the drugs. But when I was early in Taiwan, you would still get this, and you still, when you go to gay clubs here, occasionally the night will be stopped and you'll all get ID'd. Everyone will have to line up outside and show their IDs for what reason is not very clear. But so while Taiwan is quite free in that aspect, there's still conservative aspects about life here, I think.
It's a danger, isn't it, to sort of allow, ironically enough, binary thinking to think, okay, so there's two Chinas, there's Taiwan, and there's the mainland. The mainland is the oppressive place, therefore Taiwan must be liberal utopia, when like that's a mental trap. That's not attention to the actual reality on the ground.
Yeah.
Yep. There was something I was going to mention. So I'm reading a Bai Xianyang book just now, Taipei People, and I noticed like so many of the chapters are about ladies, of any particular age, and there's a huge amount of description of like their beauty and their clothes and their silk qipaos. And I was thinking like, oh, this is quite a strange thing for a male author to zoom in on so much. Is this like, has he got a fetish for this kind of women? But yeah, that sort of answers that question, I suppose. It's not that sort of a relationship with his characters he would have had, I guess.
Yeah. I think in terms of if you're gonna put Cho Miaojin in the context of Taiwanese literature, like she's following on from people like Bai Xianyang, but then also later on, well, I'm not sure if Zhu Tianwen's Notes of a Desolate Man was written at the same time, or they were published at some very closely. Like Notes of a Desolate Man and Notes of a Crocodile seem to have been published within a year of each other. But they do seem like kind of almost like bookends, like they do echo each other a lot. Like,
right. Yeah, interesting. And it's nice that their English translated titles match. It's pretty good. Is it that the Chinese titles both end in G, like Xiyoji, Journey to the West? Is it the same character?
Yeah. So it's Huangren Xiuji and Yu Xiuji. So it's show as in the hand, and then notes. Right.
Yeah, it's that's quite a nice way to translate it, I guess. Notes of It's appropriate for the book. So the next section of questions I've got here is reception and interpretation of the work. I think that we've handled this first question pretty heavily about like the context and the importance of the book in Taiwan and Taiwanese lit. But here's one thing we didn't touch on. It's the impact it had on the language. Just the really basic level that the main character is called Ladzi, or at least that's her nickname. Although that was way less prominent in the book than I think some of the coverage of the book would lead you to believe. We don't hear it until I think past halfway through. It's just a nickname. It only pops up a few times. But regardless, I've read that ladza is now used as like a synonym for like lesbian women. Well, yeah. What other kind of lesbians are there? Lesbians in Taiwan, in Taiwanese. Is that true? Am I reading stuff that is true on the ground?
Uh, I'm I'm not a lesbian myself, but
Oh,
I have heard it used in reference to lesbians. What I thought was more interesting is that it took off in mainland China. Like also in the documentary, they talked about the reception in mainland China and how although it was only officially published, I think there in 2012. Apparently before that there'd been like you were saying before about the power of the web, so that it was spread massively in online circles in mainland China before that, according to a mainland lesbian interviewed in the documentary. And so in mainland China, I think there's a lot of references to Lala as being referring to lesbian affairs or lesbians. Yeah, so it has taken on that cultural thing. I think Miaojin is very like highly regarded in lesbian circles as well, even in popular culture, I think.
Yeah, I remember seeing references to her work that aren't just framing it as like Taiwanese or Chinese lit, framing at least, or even if it's only in the context of Asian lit, that's sometimes literature translated from Chinese. It doesn't get that framing. I'm just looking up right now. Sorry, go on.
Ocean Vuong, is it Ocean Vuong?
Yeah,
His recent book had a dedication to Chiu Miaojin, and he quoted her. He quoted either Notes for Montmartre or Notes for Crocodile,
it's
or
the Montmartre one.
what?
And the reason I know that is not because I'm knowledgeable. It's because that came up in my earlier interview today with Chitawe and Ari Heinrich, because Montmartre, that's Ari's translation. So Tawe mentioned it as a way to sort of big up his translator, I think, as well as to point out the importance of this stuff, not just in an Asian context, but also Asian diaspora, Asian American context.
Actually, I really liked, even though Ocean Vuong's book is very similar to this book, I liked Ocean Vuong's book a lot more than this book. But
I've just popped Notes of a Crocodile's Chinese name into Baidu to see if Baidu will immediately give me like a pirate copy of the like the e-text. I don't know if I'm seeing that, but yeah, I'm seeing loads of options to like read it online, buy it, discussion about it. It's got a page on Douban. Douban probably be a more interesting thing to look at if I had more time, but better not to do that mid-interview. But yeah, I could see it. I could see it being really popular in the mainland for sure. Next question. It's about the book in translation, the reception of the book in translation. So again, this is probably where I went in a little bit too cynical. I did notice that in a few reviews, the reviewer had spelled her name Q-U-I, which, that shouldn't be a death sentence for the reviewer. But my suspicion with Western reception of translated Chinese stuff, and I would apply this to myself too, is that we go in looking for something that ticks our own sort of boxes and disregard everything else. And there's a line in the book. I should have. Do I have it quoted?
I know the line you're talking about with the
Yeah.
where they're at the bar and they're talking about the gender, that people have no gender.
Let's monopolize. Let's what is it? Take control of society. Start a. Oh God, where is it? Oh yeah. So one of they're talking about sort of questioning gender, and then one says the line, "Hey, we should found a gender-free society and monopolize all the public restrooms." And that's in almost every English language review of the book. And what have I got? I've got a whole rant written out here. It's quite a prophetic line because it's ahead of its time, and it's where some of the sort of debates and discourse is at today, questioning gender and finding ways to accommodate for, I guess, non-binary people, like gender-free bathrooms. But my feeling is that's not really representative of the book. There is sort of interrogation of gender, but from my point of view, it was more about sort of the binary, and then there is a line I think is deeper almost, where like anything outside the boundary is cast away and isn't even allowed to exist or have a name. So like the line about having a gender-free society, I guess that is sort of looking to the solution to the problem of having some kind of existence outside the binary. But like I didn't see an awful lot of that in the book. It's quite utopian as well for a book which is generally not very utopian. A book, not that it's 100% pessimistic, but it seemed to me to be more focused on like individuals or couples in relationships, not about groups of people planning to bring about progress in society, which is a nice narrative to read, but I don't really see it in the book. Being a bit mean here maybe to some of the reviewers, but yeah, do you have any similar misgivings about reception of the book, or do you think it's I'm being overly critical?
For me, I feel like if people are engaging with Taiwanese literature, that's already like a victory, I guess. That people are actually reading and people are engaging with it. It's already a victory. But I get your point. Like I wouldn't say that like maybe I'd say some aspects of the book do show like an idealism. Like Mengsheng, as much as he's a negative character, he does show some sensitivity and some ideals, and that kind of like that idea of like a genderless, and like his sexuality is all over the place.
Yeah,
I get what you mean though. Like, okay, so for some of the novel, I get what your point is. Like she read a little bit. The main character read a little bit like a female version of an incel. Like it's like
I was gonna say, when she was constantly leading on other girls and then dumping them, it's like, this is for straight men. This is what we call a fuckboy. Like,
yeah. It's basically like I felt like a lot of her ideas of gender were, like you said, a lot more conservative than that particular quote would point out. So she was, although you pointed out those other two couples were, well, mask for mask or whatever you want to call it, and the two more feminine girls, her dialectic seemed to be about being she goes on constantly about how her masculine, like she feels masculine energy, and that she goes on about becoming a man. In her other short story, Platonic Hair, there's a lot of disguising as masculine or becoming a man or pretending to be a man. And I think that she's a lot more conservative in her ideas than maybe Mengsheng is in the novel. So I think there's like a spectrum there. So I think there is if you look at the protagonist, this is where we get into trouble conflating Miaojin with the main character, because all of these characters are Miaojin doing her work. So there's aspects of her who she's very self-critical also. So she can see that maybe this is not a healthy way to be, but it doesn't mean that a character will not be stuck in that pattern, continuing to, like, she has like I thought it was like a very apt, her advice for Shiro or for Tuntun about love. Let me see if I can find it here. She says something. Sorry, I'll just speak 2 seconds. Okay. She says, only healthy people are capable of being in love. Using love to treat an illness just makes the illness even worse. And so she gives that advice to Tuntun, I think it is. But yet, within the novel, the protagonist is constantly doing what she says not to do. Right?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly why she knows it doesn't work. Speaking of like the character being aware of her flaws but indulging in them anyway, and maybe admitting or owning up or just giving representation to sort of more old school ideas about men, women, gender, and so on. So here's a line from the narrator early in the book. She says, "In the past, I believe that every man had his own innate prototype of a woman, and that he would fall in love with the woman who most resembled his type. Although I'm a woman, I have a female prototype too." And then skipping forward slightly, "My type would appear in hallucinations just as you were freezing to death. atop an icy mountain, a legendary beauty from the furthest reaches of fantasy. For 4 years, that's what I believed, and I wasted all my college days when I had the most courage and honesty I would ever have towards life because of it. And that's one of the bits where I was like, oh damn, it's me. It's like I'm reading my past self's self-reflections. Where yeah, like it's a far cry from the line about gender-free bathrooms, but
I think it fits into the context of like what is representative about the book, and maybe that kind of sentiment is more representative of the book than a speculation about gender-free bathrooms. But I think, to be fair, there is a lot of gender play in Cho Miaojin's work, so you can see why that kind of line would stand out to reviewers.
For sure. And I mean, I've written copy and promo and reviews before as well. And it's like, yeah, what are you going to do? Spend paragraphs going over the complicated, sometimes progressive, sometimes conservative nuances, or are you going to catch the reader's attention with something equally valid and much snappier? Like it's perfectly valid. Yeah. So right. Okay. My next question, it's if you have any sort of not necessarily unorthodox takes, but do you have any takes on the book that you've not seen anywhere else, or you maybe heard it voiced but haven't seen it sort of out there accessible in media? I mean, I guess you've already said you found the name dropping a bit annoying. I don't know if I'd seen that. And I had seen people say they found it annoying because of the overblownness, but I don't know. Is there anything else positive or negative?
Like, I would say that the thing I find frustrating about the book is her, I don't know, like the lack of progression of the character. And you see her go through the same cycle, and you want her to learn from her past, or you want her to, like, the bit that really annoyed me, like, so much so that I think I was listening to the audio of the book, and I stopped and replayed it, like, was the bit where she left Xiaofan at the hospital after, when Xiaofan is suffering from like liver failure or something. And I just thought, like, an interesting aspect of her is that she is trying to be cruel and trying to be, she says it like
Oh, I think I know the bit you mean.
Explicitly, cruelty and mercy are one and the same, and then existence in this world relegates good and evil to the exact same status. And she wants to be cruel, or she is constantly trying to make herself more cruel. And I thought that related in a way to crocodiles, in that when we think of crocodiles, not in the book specifically as they're mentioned, because they seem quite cute in the book, or like eating puff pastries. But what I thought was weird was, like, there's a lot of references to animals in the book and becoming an animal. And I think that the idea of the crocodile being cruel, she was constantly seems to be pushing herself to be an awful person. And it almost seemed like reversed, like, you know, when you're trying to make yourself better and you're giving yourself, like, I should be a nicer person, this person. It was almost, she had guilt for being nice to Shailene. She had, and whenever she showed what the reader might convey as a positive quality, she would go, oh, I was weak and I let this, like, I was nice to, and I know it's part of earlier I talked about the logic that you have when you're under this when you're repressing something about yourself, your logic can get twisted up. But I didn't really get why we were supposed to, even if we were to empathize with this character.
Yeah.
And then if she's pushing herself to be crueler and more like a crocodile, I guess, and then the crocodiles are more human. And there's a reference in the crocodile bit about whether it's a human, is a crocodile a human-looking crocodile or a crocodile-looking human or something. And I thought that was a bit of play with the idea that the main character, is more of an animal than the crocodile is an animal who is masquerading as human. But
there was a thing I noticed, that a lot of the references to animals were similar animals to crocodiles, lizards. And I was wondering, like, why are we kind of being a little bit more broad, lizards and crocodiles? And I think an answer might have occurred to me just now, that they're all cold-blooded. Pretty sure
Yeah.
crocodiles are cold-blooded anyway. And yeah, she knows she's got this, I don't know, romantic side to her, but really wishes she could correct it with a little cruelty and cold-bloodedness. And like, as kind of maybe narratively frustrating as it is, I know in myself I have this problem. I have certain tendencies. I know rationally how I could correct them, and I can rationally sort of counter, correct in the other direction or neuter those tendencies consciously. But you can never consciously monitor yourself forever, and unless your habits change over a longer term, like a gradual change, then the sort of stupid or destructive or irrational things you do or I've done have often come back and repeated, and they've only gone away, gradually over time. And I like my feeling from the book was, lads, it does sort of slowly change, but it's like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And I mean, whether or not it makes a good book, I don't know, but it felt believable to me. The other thing, I'm not sure. This is kind of just not related to what the last point, but I noted this down earlier. The advice that she gives to Juro, I think it was, about like even love not really being the answer. I thought this was pretty insightful. But then again, this is coming from me, like a straight person who's not gone through the things that the characters in the story have. But she says like, okay, so you have repressed desires and you think that being able to express them will solve all your problems. Well, I have bad news for you. You can never actually fill that hole. It'll just lead to obsessions, and you'll chase something, and you might solve your initial problem, but that it doesn't end there. There's new, possibly even more extreme problems further down the road. And I mean, I won't go into lots of personal details, but yeah, like coming out my shell, if you come out your shell, you're exposing yourself to the world. And if you start becoming more proactive, you could be throwing yourself into, all the problems life throws right back at you. So without trying to like frame that as a positive or a negative thing, I was like, damn, that's really true. And the other thing I think I've not said about the book enough yet is I thought it was, at least in translation, I'm sure it's the same for original, I thought it was really quite beautifully written. Just as a piece of prose, this is one of the best books I've done on the podcast. And I was stupid that I've not said that yet. But yeah, I thought it was, I'll stop repeating myself, but I can't say that strongly enough that just as a piece of literature, I found the book pretty beautiful and not always insightful and deep, but often spoke a lot to me. That's not really giving you a question there, have I?
No, I'm not saying that. I just like, I guess that maybe there's something in me that I am uncomfortable with, and I see that in Laza. So I still had like objectively, I could see that it's a good book, but subjectively, I guess something in it made me hate the protagonist, and I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, like on her part, but like I guess the part of you that goes through those things, you don't want to face the despair side, or you don't want to go towards that. And especially if you're LGBT, you get a lot, like all through growing up, the representations of the character gets AIDS and dies, the character gets AIDS and dies, the character is depressed and dies, the character is arrested, and then like where you have this like trope of falling in love with straight people and like it being a constantly unable to achieve, unrealistic. Like there was a show in the UK aired a few years ago called Cucumber, where one of the characters falls in love with a straight guy and then gets like killed. But like that's a fairly prominent trope in LGBT. So to be fair to Cho Miaojin, this is an early piece, so the despair is warranted. But if you get too much of that a lot, then you get it feels a bit cliched, even though it was before the cliches. It was before it was cliched.
Right. Yeah, I can see that, where it's like it's all the more frustrating where you see where this person is coming from, or you can empathize, but then they don't course correct, or they take the wrong conclusions. Like another piece of translated Chinese lit I've read is 2 books by Murong Shuesun, and this is like Toxic Masculinity, the novel, both of them, but dealing with sort of corruption in China. One of them, the main character is what is he? He's in like a state-owned enterprise. It's like the oil biz, so it's all about money. And then the other one, Dancing Through Red Dust, he's a lawyer. So it's the same thing. It's a completely corrupt business in China because at least in the novel, everything is decided beforehand and you just cash in. And in both books, just the guy, he just womanizes, he drinks, he eats, he lies, he occasionally feels guilt. And the thing driving the plot is him trying to get away with everything. And the thing that makes it interesting in translation is that it's edgy stuff that exposes the dark side of China. And like the first one where his character is like, I would say, very muddied rather than totally black-hearted. It's like, yeah, I've been a bit of an asshat. I see where this guy's coming from. I can see the guilt there, but like this is really exaggerated and crazy. I'm glad this book isn't too long. Okay, I can take it. It was quite fun read. But then the second one, it's like longer. It's way darker, way more intense. The character he does worse things. He's got far less, there's less of a human there to attach to. So again, it's like, okay, I can see these horrible tendencies, the seed of these horrible tendencies inside myself, the greed, the selfishness. But it's like, come on, man, give me something to hold on to. And like, the fact it's the second book as well, that like, he just keeps repeating this pattern in his fiction. It's like, fucking hell, I can't be 100% on board with this. It's too depressing even for me. And it's not depressing because of the content. It's depressing because, yeah, there's it's just pure indulgence. I'm not saying that Miaojin's doing pure indulgence, but yeah, the indulgence in like toxic stuff or stuff with a toxic spin to it. I can see why that would be alienating, and then even more so if it's something that you've seen over and over and over and over and over and over and over across multiple authors and medium.
Well, yeah, it's just like I think like a lot of the message of like there was recently in the gay community there was the It Gets Better campaign to try and tell young people that whatever you're going through now, in the future it'll get better for you. Like you'll be able to live your life, and it's just sad that like because you wonder like would it have gotten better for Miaojin if she had not stabbed herself? But yeah, it's just like a frustrating thing, and I guess you just have to separate it from your reading of the novel because it's not within the bounds of it. But
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm reading it from a very sort of safe seat here. Although, like, I don't know, even like the difference between the world now and what it was like when I was in high school, I think it died off a bit towards the end of my time in school, but like the first couple of years in the middle of my time in high school, it was just normal. Anything you didn't like, just call it gay. It must have been for actually like gay lads who there was one guy who was in my Reggie class all through high school who did come out. But I'm really not surprised he didn't come out until high school in the last decade, because bloody hell, it was a lot's changed just in like 10 years in the UK.
Yeah.
For sure. Things did get better, I suppose. On that slightly heavy note, I'm going to move on to some silly questions, if that's all right. Okay, so first silly question. The Chinese word of the day. Do you think there's a good sort of word or character we could use to represent the story?
I had a fun one that I found. It's like a very popular Taiwanese one that's still used like today, like Sānbā, as in 3-8.
Right.
So she uses it talking about, I think it's either Zhiro or Tun. She says like that she'll talk a lot of Sānbā Hua. Sānbā means like when someone's I had a definition here. When someone's like, it can be hot-headed or like reckless, but it's normally talked about girls, like when they're frivolous or like a giddy girl or like gossipy. It can mean a million different things though. Like if you try to use it, a Taiwanese person will have a different definition of what they think it means. So they can say, like some people think it means like bitchy. Some people think it means like superficial and like a bit silly, I guess, ditzy, as well as another.
That's a good one. Yeah, I've just Googled it and I've found a Chinese language forum. It's got a whole quite complicated top reply here. Taiwanese like to use the word Sānbā to describe female behavior bordering on craziness, such as frivolous actions or doing reckless things. It appears that the word originates from the Cantonese or Minnan dialect, but in reality it is not. In fact, Sānbā is the authentic Central Plains vocabulary, and there's even a citation all the way back to some word Zhangbā, which was a word for prostitute from the north during the Song dynasty. So, yeah,
Oh, cool.
it's apparently quite an old one.
But it's a very, very common in Taiwan, like Nihon Sānbā, like they'll always be saying that. But
okay,
yeah.
I should remember that one because those are two really, really, really easy characters to read and to remember. Yeah, number Chinese. That was like the most useful vocab my first year in China, was just the numbers. Because like ordering a fries at the KFC, I'd be like, the 18 kwai one, please. Total laziness. Anyway, next silly question. If Notes of a Crocodile was a drink, what would it be? And cocktails that are a quirky mix of everything and really strong coffees are banned because those have been grossly overused. So aside from those two, do you have anything?
Oh, actually, I didn't read the last line when I formulated my answer, but there's a bar in Taiwan called called Commander D, sorry. And they have a drink called Baby Sleeps 3 Nights. And it's the kind of drink where you have one and then you kind of lose your memory of the rest of the night. And then you wake up probably still in the bar or in the toilet of the bar and have to say goodbye to the bar staff in the morning. It's like a very strong drink, but it's like emotionally draining.
Right. Okay, there you go. Perfect.
Like a horrible hangover would be like the whole next day you'll just be hungover. Yeah.
And you'd be questioning.
That's kind of a cocktail mix of everything which you put in your band.
I think that qualifies. There was one that was big when I was an undergraduate, appropriately enough, given this is an undergrad sort of novel, in Manchester. And I don't know if this was a Manchester thing or a 2012 thing. It was called a zombie. Have you heard of that?
Sounds vaguely familiar.
It was like you drink more than one and then you become a zombie. So tiki bars were a popular hipster thing in Manchester at that time, and they all did zombies. It sounds like it might be a cousin of the Baby Sleeps for 3 nights.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, last silly question. It's not really silly. It's a self-promo slot. So there was your blog. Can you give us the URL for that one more time?
Translatingtaiwan.com.
Okay, cool. Is there anything else you'd like to self-promote?
You can just check out on Twitter at Ladenframe, LADENFRAME.
Okay, cool. And last couple of questions before we go our separate ways. Some intertextuality. So if our listeners want more of anything similar to Notes of a Crocodile, where would you direct them? I'm going to have to think myself here.
If you read Chinese, there's a good book that's just been published called Ama the 女朋友, or Grandma's Girlfriends. And it's about older generations lesbians. So it takes like a lot of people who are old ladies now and interviews them about their past. And some of them have been married and divorced. Some of them are like have been undercover. Some of them were more what we call butch. Some of them were more femme. It's a companion book to another book about older generation gays that came out a few years ago. I'd also recommend there's a podcast if you want to practice your Chinese as well. There's a podcast called Wet Boy Podcast. It's Runnan, and he's quite good. He focuses on gay issues and talks about a lot of modern gay cultural stuff, which is quite interesting. And yeah.
All right, cool.
Recommended.
Yeah, I've got a couple. So I did this last time around, Tawe and Ari recommending all this great queer literature, and then I was like, here's my straight books that I'll recommend. So I'll do that again. We mentioned No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai quite a few times, and like if listeners, if you want to read something about a painfully self-aware alienated individual that's short and very readable, bingo, that's a great book. Also, I guess also sort of transgressive in various ways. It's not a nice PC book, but it's also not anything that would switch you off unless you're really squeamish, I think. And then another one, this is a book that is quite appropriate, I think, just personally, an author who captures like the sort of painfully self-conscious younger person trying to come to terms with like their desires, and in this case the opposite sex, but that doesn't matter so much, just that whoever you happen to be attracted to, being attracted to people, is Alistair Gray. He's a really great Scottish author. He passed away just a couple of years ago. He was a Glaswegian, and actually he's got two books that would both be really great recommendations. One is called Poor Things, and it's actually getting a film adaptation. Is in the works. It's a retelling of Frankenstein. I'm probably less well placed to summarize that one because I've only read it the once. But his other book, his masterpiece, Lanark, A Life in 4 Books, it's huge. So it's not as small as Notes of a Crocodile, but you deal with these two parallel lives of these alienated men. One lives in a fantasy Glasgow. One lives in real sort of wartime and then post-war Glasgow. And he, especially the realist one, he starts off in school, growing up as a boy. So it's got a sort of James Joyce portrait of an artist as a young man sort of vibe to it, which a bit like that book, it's not as unreadable as the later Joyce stuff. It's got a fairly, the Bildungsroman development of an individual sort of narrative. And so again, a bit more of a linear progression than Notes of a Crocodile, just because he's literally growing up. He's at least physically getting bigger. And then the second part of the realist section of the novel, he's in art school. So he's trying to figure himself out, both as a erotic individual and as an artistic individual, to use some fancy words. But he's got the similar pathology to Ladza in that he gets very stuck onto his twisted, self-destructive logic and sort of rides that train down often the wrong path. And if you've done that yourself as a teenager or a 20-something, or even any time in your life, you probably relate to it. So yeah, I really recommend Lanark, but it's big. It's a big book. Last question, what are you reading just now?
I'm reading, there's a professor at NTU called Michelle Huang. She researches geography. She's got a book called Zhonggang Xinganjue, like New Feelings Between China and Hong Kong. It deals with the relations between Taiwan, China, and Hong Kong through the medium of popular film and popular novels. So she looks at contemporary literature and sees the themes and how it develops between, for example, Hong Kong used to see itself as the more developed of between China and Hong Kong. But now that has shifted, and the dynamic now in popular literature is that Hong Kong is lagging behind and is looking to go to China to develop or to bring development. But it's very interesting so far. It's actually brought up a lot of good films that people can go and watch as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, my what are you reading just now is going to be a bit dull for listeners because I'm recording this the same day I recorded The Membranes, so I'm obviously reading the same book. I didn't happen to finish that book and start my next one in the 2 hours between these two calls, but it's Taipei People by Xian Yong. But now I'll be reading it knowing that he was a gay man, so that sort of reframes things. I mean, better late than never. I'm like 80% of the way through the book, but yeah.
I think, like, for me, I didn't enjoy Taipei People as much as Crystal Boys. But I think maybe, a lot of people think that Taipei People is a better literary work, but I feel like Crystal Boys was more enjoyable.
I did notice one of the, I wasn't sure if Crystal Boys was a short story because one of the Taipei People shorts that I just finished, either most recently or second most recently, there's a character, I think he's an older man who frequents a park. It might be that same park. And it's sort of in the background, yeah, there are these boys who are, I guess, getting picked up or picking each other up or something. And I didn't really know what to make of it. I didn't know how to fit that into the context or if that was a real thing in Taiwan at the time. But I guess now I know. So yeah. All right, that's all my questions. So I think I'll draw the interview to a close. But before I do, is there anything we've not said that we've missed that you think we ought to close on, or do you think we're all good?
I think we're okay.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm glad you didn't get buried by an earthquake midway through the call. That's encouraging.
I hope that maybe people can, if they want a more expert opinion on the stuff as well, they can reach out to Ji Daowei, or like he knows a lot. He's got Twitter, I think. He has a lot more knowledge in this area than I do. But
yeah, and I actually asked him when we were doing this segment of the show as like self-promo slot. He named his Instagram, his Twitter, and I was like, so are you open to just listeners of the show just quizzing you? And he's like, yeah, new friends. So I second what you just said there. That's the end of the show. So just the plugs to go now. I don't really have anything spectacular prepared. Just social media. It's the usual: Instagram, Twitter, and Discord. Instagram is at TrChFic, TrChFic. Twitter is it's just myself at Angus Likes Words. There's a link to join the show's Discord in the show notes at the bottom. Yeah, I mean, if you want to give feedback on the episode, then Twitter and IG are fun places to do that, to just speak to me directly. Also to keep up with things I'm talking about on social media or updates about the show, obviously. If you'd like to give some more collective feedback that'll reach other fans, Discord is where you want to go. That's all I've got to say, really. To support the show tangibly, which means with money, there is a support page on the show's homepage, which is at TrChFic, TrChFic.podbean.com, and there's a support page on there where you can find all the ways you can support the show. Best one's probably Patreon, because that will get you access to a gazillion billion bonus shows, all averaging probably about half an hour long, some shorter, some even longer. I think most recently we've had some bonus episodes up on actually Notes of a Crocodile. That just went up a couple days before recording this one, I believe. Also 2 episodes on Wang Shuo's Playing for Thrills. Yes, that one. And there's more lined up, some auxiliary episodes on books that are going to be covered in this Taiwan season. And other stuff that will probably never be done on the show because it's not fiction, or it's not translated, or if it is translated, it's not from Chinese. I did a non-fiction book translated from German to English, Shanzhai by Byung-Chul Han, the German, Korean, Swiss, maybe I didn't order those correctly, cultural theorist. So yeah, there's some really out there stuff on the Patreon, blah, blah, blah. Support the show. You know the deal. But of course, you'll probably also know what I'm going to say next, and that is the best way to support the show has nothing to do with social media or indeed with money. It's about spreading the word. So if you know anybody, could be a teacher, a friend, an online entity, a crocodile at the bottom of a swamp, anyone at all that might enjoy the show, just tell them about it. I think that's the best thing you can do. And even if they don't take up your suggestion, at least you'll have had a conversation, a precious thing in this sad and lonely world. So until the next episode, 再见。